the RIBA guidance, which I wrote and was published in February. Um, this is, as you can see, it's got the Google headquarters project on the cover. Um, it's available free from the RIBA website and can be downloaded. The difference between this document and the RICS document is that the RICS document is a technical document, and it's got about 50 odd pages. This is definitely not a technical document. It's in, I'm an architect, it's in the sort of language I can understand, so it's not too complicated and easy to read. It's basically explaining how the RICS document works, and it's a very, if you just want to understand how whole life assessment works, this is the document to look at. If you really want to get technical, then you want the RICS document. So they kind of work together. What this also does is will take us through the RIBA stages. So that's really summarizing what I've said. So this is feeding into this document, and then we'll take you through the RIBA. I'll take you through the RIBA stages in a minute. So the guidance will introduce architects to whole life thinking, and I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of, not surprising, but a lot of uninformed activity without people understanding what this is all about. And I think it's an opportunity for architects to engage in whole life thinking, is to actually take more possession of the way their buildings are used, the energy their buildings are using, both operationally and in an embodied sense. So there we are. Energy and carbon are not somebody else's problem, which is typically what architects tend to think. Help architects offer a more informed service, material sourcing, and as I think Ed really intimated, that you can't really understand how your building works without really understanding the supply chain, where things come from, and how they are made. And this is really important in low carbon thinking, but also a better building, in my view. Environmental impacts, we need to understand better about those as an architect. Understand their buildings better over the entire life cycle. So also in the guidance, there's some pretty pictures, because I know as an architect we like pretty pictures. So this is Dalston by Wall Thistleton. What you're looking at here is a timber structure which will then be clad in brick, CLT. We've then got, this is a house project by Anupama Kundu in India. And all of these have had carbon assessments and been thought of from the perspective of whole life thinking. This you'll probably recognize, the Enterprise Centre in Norwich. This is thatch cladding. Then we've got the World Wildlife Fund headquarters in Woking. And then this one you'll recognize from Ed Dixon, the 21 Moorfields in the City of London. So taking you through the stages. So the RIBA Stage 0, strategic definition. What we're trying to achieve here is a client decision to include embodied and whole life assessments within the project. And I think obviously you need the client to be on board, otherwise you're not going to go anywhere. I think some of the reasons you might explain to the client would be more efficient building, marketing advantages, reduced maintenance, contribution to value engineering. And I think it's fair to say, in working with Ed, in some examples we can point to where the choice of a different material has actually been cheaper. And indeed, as you can imagine, most of our clients are not interested in spending extra money on achieving a lower carbon output. So typically what we're finding is that we can contribute to value engineering, and of course then future-proofing asset value. That may be in terms of forthcoming or potential legislation, but also just again producing, I think, an overall better building. Stage 1, preparation and brief. So this is then working out that whole life carbon would be part of the sustainability aspirations, and we'll be looking at the overall strategic direction of the project design. What is the overall concept? How does sustainability and how does carbon fit into that? And what is the scope of any assessment you might do? Is it, as I was showing you earlier, the minimum requirement? Is it cradle to cradle? Is it full whole life? RIBA Stage 2, concept design. This is a really important stage where really fundamental decisions get made, and this is where you might be looking at design options for the major built systems. And what this is suggesting is that, for example, when you're talking about something like cladding, as I've already mentioned, you'd be looking at how the cladding design and the environmental performance of the building, the environmental systems, how all of those integrate to achieve the most efficient operational outcome, but also to achieve the most efficient embodied outcome, and those two things work together. So you also be looking at potential life cycle issues, things like climate change. What is the potential impact on your building? If you've got a building which is going to, let's say it's all glass and it's going to be problematic 40, 50 years down the line with increase in temperature, how problematic is that? Is that something we should be thinking about at design stage? Things like future flexibility. If a building is very flexible, then clearly you don't have to change it. There's less future carbon costs in the going forward. Material strategy is obviously an important thing. Recycled content and how much you might use and include within the scheme. And future deconstruction disposal. Again, that aids things like recyclability and avoids waste, or reduces waste, hopefully. Stage 3, develop design. So this is where you might do if you like, a full whole life carbon assessment using the cost plan as your basic source of data and of course drawings and so on. So you'd be doing an initial carbon budget. You'd be can look at life cycle costing because these things obviously go together. Low carbon, cost neutral options, you start to look at those in more detail and examine those with the quantity surveyor to make sure that you're not, as I said, spending unnecessary money. You'd be also looking at things like construction methodologies. You will have heard, probably if you've been, the rest of you could build things like off-site construction and so on, and CLT and different methodologies can all help. And you want to obviously be thinking about these in detail at this stage. Planning, I put that because some of you may have, there's some authorities that are just starting to ask for, take an interest, for example, Hackney and others are going to take an interest in the carbon cost of buildings. And with the GLA, the London plan, there's been a lot of representation to encourage the London plan to adopt a broader definition of whole life carbon. Embodied carbon is already mentioned, and construction carbon is already mentioned, but the idea is to make that better. So there's things happening there. And BREEAM I mentioned because BREEAM 2018 includes life cycle assessment in MAT 01, and it also includes embodied carbon as part of that assessment. So BREEAM is also moving into this place. Stage 4, technical design, low carbon choices made during stage 3 should now be integrated. And obviously we want to get those into the supply chain. And the important thing here is that you firstly want to really understand your suppliers. And again, that goes back to the supply chain, feed that back into the design. But it's really also important that we don't put a burden on the supply chain, that the design or in requesting information about carbon cost of buildings, we're not pushing up costs. So for example, if you're asking for you want to know about the recycled content in, say, aluminium, we would recommend you don't say you've got to provide X percent. We'd be recommending you say what percentage can you provide, or can you provide 50% recycled content, and so on. So it's really important that you engage in a positive way with the supply chain. Construction, what we tend to get involved with is actually sort of monitoring this, and again, you don't want to be a burden to the whole process, but it's most of the information that we need really comes out of what the contractors are doing. They usually have very good records of they should have material arriving on site, how they're transporting things, and so on. So all of that we would be looking to examine. And then, of course, handover and close out. At that stage, you'd be looking to review what you've done, and we or others would do a final assessment and look at how that compares to what you did earlier. Are there any lessons that can be learned? And putting this all into the O&M manuals. And POE is really important, and as anyway, and what we would be recommending is that you include not just the post-occupancy evaluation of the energy the building is using, but also the physical durability of the building. Is it performing in the way that it was expected to at design stage? So the guidance will encourage architects to engage directly with carbon emissions reduction. in other words, not treated as somebody else's problem, designed for future durability and flexibility, focus on the sourcing materials and products, consider post-completion life cycle and maintenance, so think long term, designed for future assembly, disassembly and recycling. I think this is, again, part of long-term thinking. And I put this down because I'm chair of the RIBA Sustainable Futures Group, and two areas which we've been working on. One is the RIBA awards criteria, and a new set of awards criteria came out. If any of you have been applying for RIBA awards, you would have come across them. The sustainability awards had really focused purely on operational activity, operational performance of a building. And what that meant was an architect, in applying for an award, would just hand it straight to the MEP consultant and say, you sort that out, which of course is not what we're trying to get architects to think about. So what has happened is this has been expanded to include things like biodiversity, ethical sourcing, life cycle, and so on. So it has expanded. The plan of work is something that's being worked on at the moment, and at the way things currently are, is that the plan of work, which some of you may be familiar with, has a sort of a sustainability bar, which basically refers you to something else all the way along. And that something else, who knows where it is, impossible to find. So what we are working on is a sort of sustainability overlay, which is covering all aspects of sustainability. And the idea is that it basically gets riveted onto the plan of work. So it's not some separate document that's going to get lost or not used and so on, but it's something that would be used as part of the general design thinking and the way the RIBA stages work. So you've got the whole life carbon assessment. We've talked about that. We've talked about embodied and whole life carbon. The RAP, this is some RAP guidance, and as James mentioned, they've bought the RAP database, and the idea is to collect that information. I think as that information is collected, it'll get more and more reliable. Then there's Construction Products Association, the embodied impacts of construction products. There's more useful information. If you're really interested, there's my book, Targeting Zero, which explains embodied and whole life carbon. In fact, the RIBA bookshop is, I think, selling it, so shameless plug there. But also the UK Green Building Council has produced embodied carbon, developing a client brief. And if you're interested in developing on that, then that's well worth having.